Hello, everyone. Welcome to the UpRev Ninja Podcast. If this is your first time listening, thanks for joining us. This show is produced each week with the single intent of discovering the tips, tricks, hacks, and lessons learned from our guests that has catapulted them into living the best version of themselves. Join your host, Tom Hudson, as he continues his search for the best methods to UpRev his life. Now, let's dive into the show.
Today's guest is Janine Iannarelli. Janine is the CEO of Par Avion Limited, the female-owned seller of business aviation. She's going to share with us wisdom on branching out on her own, selling private business aviation, and the challenges and successes of being a female entrepreneur, and more. Please welcome Janine to the UpRev Ninja Podcast. Hey, welcome Janine to the UpRev Ninja Podcast. How are you today?
I'm wonderful. Thank you for the opportunity to join you today.
Yeah, so you're in Houston, is that right?
I am. I'm based in Houston, Texas.
All right. So, yeah, it's like 8 hours south where I grew up. I don't miss the weather, to be completely honest with you.
Well, that's understandable.
So, I've already read your bio out to my audience, but I would love for you to kind of tell us just who you are, how you got to where you are, and just give us a little story about yourself.
Oh. Well, the truth be known, I'm just a small-town girl who grew up on the East Coast, but in the shadow of a big city, that being New York City.
Oh, yeah.
And always had a spirit for adventure and doing something a little bit outside of the box, if you will, before that became, a very sort of catch-all phrase to describe doing something other than what's, line-itemed out for you in your job description. And an opportunity presented itself while I was in my last semester at university to work for an entrepreneur in the aviation industry, and that sector of the aviation industry happened to be the business aviation end of the business. So I took a part-time job, was exposed to what I thought was a very interesting, dynamic industry, and at the end of the day, turned down the job that I had lined up upon graduation, which was a hard-fought-for and hard-to-come-by job in advertising. In part, the epiphany I had in the course of this part-time job is what I really wanted to do was account work and work with individuals and help them develop a concept or solve a problem. And in this case, it was all about helping them find the perfect aircraft.
Yeah.
And that first job was a springboard to entering into the aircraft sales end of the industry. Fast forward X amount of years, and here you are today.
That's fantastic. It's funny. I almost went to Embry-Riddle. Yeah, I didn't. I chose a different path. But I have actually, I couldn't tell you the name of it now, but I've flown a couple of the simulators at SemiFlight at the DFW hub.
You are a very lucky person to get to do that.
Absolutely. I've got a very good friend that worked there, and third shift, they always had to test the equipment, so I would go in.
Sure.
And this was years ago, but man, it was fantastic, and knowing what those cost per hour to run.
Well, it's an interesting view of what flight crews deal with on the normal basis and then the abnormal basis. And I think it has a greater appreciation for the complexity of today's cockpits.
Yeah. No, I can appreciate that. I mean, nothing is... It's so hard to be a master at anything now. There's so many details and minutiae to everything. It's so difficult.
You touch on a very good point there. Hard to be a master of so many different things. And isn't it funny how I find that still some people are trying to hang out a shingle and claim they do many different things.
Right.
And I digress perhaps from what you wanted to share with your audience, but it harks back to a message that my employer, the person who really shaped my career in aircraft sales, said to me, because I questioned, why don't we do this? Why don't we do this? It just seemed, great synergy in selling airplanes while we also chartered them. And he said, you know what? You do one thing and you do it really well, and you stay focused on it, and you become the expert in that field.
That's fantastic. Yeah, I agree. I do agree. It's just, I don't think a lot of businesses, especially corporations, are shaped that way anymore. And, it's definitely challenging. But I do agree with you. So there was an interesting story I read about, now I might get this a little incorrect here, but you trying to get an aircraft from what was it, Southern Africa?
Correct.
Yeah.
I helped.
What was that like?
Well, that was quite an adventure, particularly at that time, and particularly when you think about the type of equipment that we were repositioning from Cape Town, South Africa, back to Texas. I had actually sold these aircraft to a Texas-based company, and when the opportunity arose to travel with the airplane, I said, why not? Because I don't know when ever in my lifetime that would present itself. For that matter, the opportunity to travel to some of the countries that we were going to make a stop in. It was long, it was tiring, it was challenging, and on many levels. Weather was perhaps the only thing we didn't run into, but leaving Cape Town, heading up the west coast of Africa, there was political and military conflicts everywhere from Angola on up to the Ivory Coast. We made stops where nobody spoke English, they spoke French, and we crossed the Sahara Desert, which was another interesting adventure, and then into the Canary Islands, and then up into Spain and up to Paris, and then you have the whole North Atlantic crossing after that. So it was an adventure, to say the least.
So how, I mean, I have to assume there's some stories in there, challenges and adversity that you personally had to deal with and overcome, especially in some of those, the lack of a better term, third world countries. And I think some of the culture there, and I could be wrong, but, you being a female, I'm sure that could have caused some conflict along the way. Did anything like that happen?
No, and actually I was well briefed by a client of mine in Europe, and he said, remember, these are matriarchal societies. He said, you're going to have a lot more say than you think.
Wow.
And I think what was the most interesting part about it is you're traveling on an aircraft that now carries the registration of the United States. And I wasn't quite sure how that would be received traveling through some of these countries.
Right.
And then, white female, which they don't see many of in some of those countries, and stepping off an airplane. It was not the first country, because the first stop was in a place called Windhoek, Namibia, which was pretty straightforward, got our fuel, moved on. The second was in Gabon, and that was the eye-opener. That was an airport where, you just took one look around, and you were definitely in third world operation, and we landed at about an hour when people must have been getting off work, and they had no gumption walking right alongside the runway or up the runway, and we found that very disconcerting.
Right.
And then when we went to get our fuel, now we're in the first time we're encountered with French was the only language. And the buyer, who I let him deal with it because he was the owner of the airplane and one of the crew members, and we had a South African crew member along with us. And I, noticed I'm listening to them, and they're gesturing what they wanted. And finally I said, he's asking how much fuel you want. And their heads were like on swivel sticks, and they looked at me and they said, you understand French? And I said, well, yeah. I mean, I took it in school, and I study it now. And so at that moment forward, till we got through Africa, they left it up to me.
Wow.
Because I suddenly earned some credibility here.
Yeah.
Got us fueled and just basically went on from there. So I'd say the challenge was the language barrier at first, and the other really insightfulness I got out of traveling like this is when we landed in Bamako, and there was nobody to be seen, nobody. And the captain said, well, I'm going to go on in, which was a long walk across the ramp, and get us sorted out in terms of our documentation. Let's get some fuel ordered. And I'm standing there, and suddenly people start drifting out of, I don't know where. It's like they came out of the bushes.
Wow.
And because I don't know where they were standing around until we had quite a crowd around the airplane. And, of course, what they want is whatever we're going to hand them. And the South African captain had already warned me and said, look, don't start giving any of the supplies off the airplane until we absolutely need to start leaving. So I was chatting with them in French and broken English, and of course then the request starts to come for money, which we're not going to give them any money.
Right.
And then it's cigarettes, which of course we're not carrying any.
Right.
And then finally when one of the captains was trying to make his way back to the airplane, which is now 10 deep with people, and I had already assessed the situation and leaned back into the airplane. It's a small aircraft now, so we're not really, in a position where there's stand-up room. But the other pilot was sitting down, and I said, if I were you, I would start the right engine. I see the captain coming. Let's just start the engine, and let's get, ready to just pull out of here. And as the captain got near, that's when I reached to the supplies and started throwing whatever small goods we had, gum, candy, and you throw them to the back of the crowd.
Right.
And people move away a little bit, and captain got on board, and this was a 2-door entry, like a clamshell. We closed the lower half, we slammed the upper half, and by then they started to drift away, fortunately, and we started the other engine and left.
Wow.
But there's a moment there that you wonder, it could go a completely different way. Would I go back to Bamako today? Probably not. I don't even know if I can. But at the time, it was an interesting adventure.
Wow.
And then from there, we crossed the Sahara Desert, and so that's where you hope you just don't break down.
Right. I can't even imagine. Yeah. What was that like?
Well, I mean, you've got X amount of hours before you reach your next destination, and there are no other alternatives. You're now at a point where, you're watching where your alternate airport is in the event you have a problem. So you just don't think about it. You just go.
Right.
That's it.
So, you mentioned earlier about, going to school and coming out and having this fantastic mentor, and now you're the CEO of this company. What there's been a journey there. Has there ever been, or continues to be, something that's kind of held you back? A lot of us, it's shame, fear, I'm not good enough, or there's something in our head that's always kind of talking to us. What have you overcome over the years? I mean, obviously you have. You're very successful.
Well, I think everybody deals to a certain degree with confidence. Yeah. And frankly, every time you achieve success, you add to the confidence side of the scale. So it would be independent decision-making along the way, especially when you don't have someone to share the situation with and help evaluate the choices. So many times it's left to me to make a decision. And I would say that taking the bolder move in certain areas where perhaps it would have been a bit more profitable, such as buying the aircraft for resale, taking on that kind of risk, and I elected not to. Maybe I'll look back and say I should have done a little bit more of that. But I set out a clear plan when I started my own company, and that was basically not to have a conflict of interest as to whose interests I represent when trying to sell more than one aircraft. But, beyond that, I've always been a bold and brave individual, and I scare myself, is what I'd like to say.
No, that's good. So what about, I assume you still have mentors this day. What about advice that you get often to, help you overcome any challenges that you have in your, day-to-day life, or even strategically? What kind of advice do you often seek out?
Well, I would say rather than mentors, it's more of a team that I've assembled that I would call and question as to what would you consider doing if faced with this sort of situation. And most of the advice that's coming is perhaps legal or financial as to next steps or how to better my position. I look for sounding boards. I look for someone with equal or more experience, obviously, or perhaps totally different experience, different industry, and ask them to evaluate how would you go about doing this if presented with a similar situation. I validate my own decisions at times because when you work alone at the top, you have a lot of people looking to you for advice and guidance, but it's always nice to have someone with expertise in a particular area to share their experience with you.
Right. Yeah, I understand that. What about tips, tricks, hacks? What do you do to keep your mind, to sharpen your saw and keep your mind sharp, and
There is always a new challenge in my industry.
I'm in the medical industry, so I've got the FDA to worry about. So
I think I think what I can say that I do is try not to be lazy, because I find that many of my peers will do the Cliff Note version of learning something, if they even go to the Cliff Note version.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And I tend to sit there and pull on the thread and let it unravel and let it take me to where I need to go to learn more about a particular problem, enhancement, modification, or difference within the market. I mean, I dig deep.
Wow.
And that's what I do, and I sometimes have to talk myself into doing it and allocating the time to do it, because, one, it makes me smarter, and not just smarter for my own personal growth, but smarter than my competitors. And when you have to make your mind work, you help to keep it sharp.
You know, thank you for sharing that, because a number of years ago, I reported into someone that had that approach, and I did not understand it at all. I was just like, someone at that level, why do you need to go down to that level? And honestly, I was fine, and I moved on, dealt with it, and we had a good working relationship, but it was never really explained to me, and I never could wrap my head around it. But that explanation is superb. So thank you. That's good. So
good.
What about it sounds like diving deep into the details. Obviously, this trip across Africa and across the Atlantic kind of pushed you out of your comfort zone. But what do you do now to help you kind of make sure you're not stagnant and always growing?
Well, I make sure that I attend as often as possible industry-sponsored events. Certainly, I attend our industry conventions, but if an OEM or another, let's say, service provider offers me an opportunity to attend a seminar on some new enhancements or upgrades to the avionics of an airplane, I'll take that opportunity. I mean, I want to evolve in that regard. In addition, with growing my own business or how to improve, I like to bring in bright young talent that helps me to continue to think outside the box. I'd like to learn from them what they're learning in school, what is a new direction, what's innovative products, tools for marketing, and share my wisdom as well as learn from them.
That's fantastic. Is there something that you're currently working on? Technology in your field must change like overnight.
Well, I wouldn't say it necessarily changes overnight, but it certainly does evolve, and operators are always looking for new enhancements. I would say that the product that is of most interest, regardless of the nature of the operation, is Wi-Fi capability. And high-speed data has many different levels of relevance. And so what's interesting for aircraft today is KU band, which is going to be the broadest, and as I understand it, what little I understand of it right now, fastest, but of course it is among the most expensive modifications, and it's not worldwide yet. So buyers of aircraft, large aircraft in particular, with the international capability, have to evaluate the investment versus the return. And that's the challenge, I think, right now for me, is to help them decide, what do you do?
Right. What do you feel... what habits do you have? You've already alluded to a few, or you've stated a few already. But what other habits do you have that you feel that just really contribute to your continual growth and trying to, again, just make sure you're always on top of your game?
Well, I guess I would employ a few colloquialisms to explain that. And one of them is, I read a book once called Eat That Frog, which
Seth
basically...
Godin.
It encourages you to do the most difficult task because you keep avoiding it. So time management is really one of the most important skill sets anyone can employ, because there's only so many hours a day. So I prioritize. Each day is prioritized by tasks that absolutely must be done, those that need to be done, and then those that I'd like to get them done. And I have piles, and I go through the urgent tasks right away. And along with that, you need to be very flexible, because there's always going to be another urgent matter that's going to present itself in the course of the day that needs to be tackled. Don't put off till tomorrow what you can get done today. I absolutely try to do that every single day. And another thing, and I try to teach some of the younger people who join the company this, when it gets really stressful and you don't know what to do next, I encourage them to pick a relatively simple task and finish that, because it gives you a sense of accomplishment and a deep sigh of relief that you've done something instead of just staring at 50 different things that need to be done and not knowing what to start with. So that to me is kind of like the relaxer, the take a deep breath, get up and walk away from your desk. But when you don't want to do that, do something simple. You'll have a sense of accomplishment, and it'll empower you to go on and do the more difficult task. And I try to organize my desk every day before I quit for the day, because at least when I come back in the morning with a fresh mind, I see clearly where I need to start.
I love that. And your talk on time management, I'm completely in agreement. I mean, time is the one resource we can't manufacture. I mean, I can always...
And you can't buy it.
Yeah. I mean, I can
always... buy it back.
No, you can't. So that it's finite, and it's more than finite because you don't even know how much time you have. So, yeah. Well, what about just kind of wrapping up here, like parting guidance, wisdom? There's been some nuggets you've already thrown out there, I think, but based on your journey through life and what you've learned so far, you have any wisdom to shed on us?
Well, no matter who you are, I think you need a mentor, and that's male or female, someone within the company that's willing to be your sounding board and to offer guidance. That's extremely important to career development and an essential key to success, because no one person can do it alone. You can end up running a company, you can have a small business, or you can run a multinational corporation, but you had to get there somewhere, and someone had to help you navigate your way to that top, because there are politics regardless of the size of the company. It's just
right.
How do you deal with them? So I'd certainly encourage everyone to have someone who is your sounding board. The other piece of advice, and this is mostly applicable to someone who's new in a position, is to do more than what's expected. And we're seeing a culture of doing as little as possible. And frankly, I'm sure this is something you'll hear over and over if you haven't already, is that the millennials, and I don't mean to deride the millennials, but they've been cultivated or raised in an environment of, well, this is not as important to me when you get to the workforce. They're more interested in things that benefit them. At least that's my personal experience.
Right.
And what I've heard from others. And they're not really willing to give more to a job. And frankly, the business world, regardless of what you do, is built around that percentage of the workforce that is willing to do more. And those are the ones that will always go farthest in their career. So if you want to stand out in a job and hope to have more opportunity, you have to do more than what's expected of you.
I agree. Well, Janine, what about what's the best way for people to find out more about you or your company?
That would be through our website, paravionltd.com.
Okay, and I'll put that in the show notes. So thank you for that. And is there anything that we didn't review or go over that you would like to bring up or discuss?
No, well, here's just something if you want to think on for a moment is, and I've had it brought up when I'm doing some public speaking, they talk about life-work balance. And I have frankly told women's groups mostly there is no such thing. If you truly want to be an entrepreneur and succeed, if you achieve it, you're basically relinquishing control of your company. But if you're small and you're an entrepreneur, there is no such thing as work-life balance, or at least not early on in your career. You better be prepared to just work, with enjoyment in between. But it's still a long path, unless you're like the founder of Facebook or Google, or you're lucky enough to have been a real visionary that can fast-track a company. Outside of that, the rest of us are going to work like dogs.
Oh, yeah.
Actually, my dog doesn't work very hard. He sleeps on his bed. Yeah,
no, and I do agree with that. I think I think one of the differences with entrepreneurs is their sense of passion and their sense of like dedication, where the number of hours doesn't, I mean, yeah, it means something to everyone, but it doesn't mean, they're not punching a clock. And some people, that's all they're doing. And you kind of mentioned this earlier, specifically about millennials, but some people punch the clock. They're there for their paycheck. They don't, they don't see the company's mission or vision and values, and they don't integrate that into who they are. So I do think that's going to be a shift with this current generation and the future generations, I think, because I'm hearing and seeing more of that. They're like, what's the company's mission? And then if that relates to them and they identify with it, then they're on board. That's kind of what I'm seeing. So
exactly that.
Well, Janine, thank you very much for your time today. I enjoyed this, and I think people are going to get a lot of golden nuggets out of this. So thank you.
My pleasure. Well, I hope it was beneficial. I certainly appreciate the opportunity, and I enjoyed this opportunity to speak with you.
So Janine's pretty inspirational. As she stated, she's from a small town in the shadow of a big city. I love that. I'm going to use that as a quote in the future. Anyway, she's had a lot of adventures in a very difficult industry. And what was awesome was that she learned early on in her career what she wanted to do, which led her to where she is today. So, she discusses some of her key challenges, one of which is that deep dive experience that she talks about the expedition of taking the aircraft from South Africa all the way up through the Sahara Desert into Europe, across the Atlantic, back to the United States. I think that one little story has a ton of little nuggets in there that you can kind of dive into and churn out a lot of good lessons learned that you could probably integrate into your life. What were some of your key takeaways?
Thanks for listening to the UpRev Ninja podcast with your host, Tom Hudson. Navigate to our website at uprev.ninja today, where you will find additional resources to help you discover the best version of you. While you're there, join our newsletter and join the discussion on your favorite social media platforms. We've got some awesome guests lined up to share with us how they are becoming the best versions of themselves. Again, thank you for listening. Now it's time to go out and uprev your life.